Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 10th annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I'm Jamie Machik with the I'm not with the Wild Wisconsin, I'm with the Wisconsin Valley Library Service, and I'm moderating the opening session today. Assisting me is Jean Anderson with the South Central Library System, and we're so glad you joined us for not just the opening session, but for our conference. So our presenter for our opening session is Aloziem. I think I said that correctly. Okay, awesome, great. And she is with the Denver Public Library, and she's going to be talking about radical imagination. So some of you might be thinking, what is radical imagination? Well, she's going to tell us. She's going to tell us what it is, how it relates to libraries, and how it can be used possibly to improve and innovate our libraries. So Ozzy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Good morning, everyone. I am so excited to be here. It's a bit early for me, but I am looking forward to this conversation. So I am Aloziem. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a dark-skinned Black woman that is wearing a lovely yellow sweatshirt with an image of a Black woman reading books. I'm wearing a pink headscarf and dark brown glasses, and I'm sitting in my home office with a backdrop of books and some art depicting Black women. And I offer a visual descriptor because I am trying to be more thoughtful about moving and operating from a praxis of accessibility. I don't want to assume or make any assumptions about how people are experiencing the space. And so I will do my best to describe the slides that are on the screen so that I am being more thoughtful about how people might be engaging in the space. I also want to make sure I can see the chat in case something comes up. Okay, cool. So on the screen, my favorite color is yellow. I feel like I could do a whole webinar on why I love the color yellow, but I've chosen a yellow PowerPoint deck. And so on the screen it says Radical Imagination in the Future of Libraries. So moving into the agenda, today we are going to do some introduction and norms. The second thing we're going to do is a radical imagination overview, which is what is radical imagination theoretically. And then I'm going to talk about something that I'm really, really passionate about, which is Proyecto Sobremesa, the radical imagination game. And so this is a practical application of radical imagination. And part of the debrief, more so a discussion of how does this show up in different ways in our life? How do we take it from the theory to, okay, here is a way to practice this, and then what is the utility of it is what I'm hoping to sort of present here today. So now on the screen, it says introduction and norms. I think it's really important to be really thoughtful and intentional about how we're showing up in a space and who we are within a space. And so I want to share a bit about me. This slide on the screen includes some of what showed up in the bio that was shared with you all, as well as some other things that I think are just really important and core to my human being. On the screen is an image created by my friend Octavia of Pretty in Ink Press. She is a lovely Black woman who does amazing illustrations, and she created this for me for my birthday. I had a yellow birthday where I wore yellow, and I invited a close group of friends to go to the mountains with me, and they all wore yellow. And it just has some other words describing things that she felt are core to who I am. And so I just really like that image, and I think it's really representative of me, so I include that in my slide deck. But it says, Ozioma Nkechi Aloziem is an Igbo scholar situated at the intersection of multiple ways of knowing. She is a Nigerian-American sunflower that is passionate about books and chicken wings. Originally raised on Omaha land, Ozzy has been a visitor on Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute territories, Denver, Colorado, since 2015. Ozioma means good news Nkechi means God's gift or gift from God, and Aloziem was my great-great-grandfather's first name. That is really important to me because it's part of my cultural identity. As an Igbo woman, as an Igbo person, we believe that our names should signify who we are. They should tell a story of our people and what we value. The Igbos are one of the oldest and largest tribes in Nigeria, or in Africa, and are indigenous to Southeast Nigeria, which is where my ancestral homes reside and where all of my family outside of my immediate family are. And so that is really core to me because it shapes my relationship to the world in a lot of ways. I think about connection a lot in terms of what is my connection to myself? What is my connection to the land that I'm on? What is my connection to the people that I'm in community with? What is my connection to the work that I do, to the food that I consume, all of the things. And I think that is really, really indicative of how I was raised, and how my Igbo indigeneity shows up in my personal and professional life. I think it's important to know, I think we all probably in the last 2 years have seen quite a bit of, we've seen a move towards using land acknowledgments, which I think is really, really, really great. I think that's really important. But I think it's really important to know why we do land acknowledgments. Land acknowledgments, one, are Indigenous practice, right? It's important for us to name our lineage and our connection to the people we're in conversation with, right? But also the land that we're on. And so doing a land acknowledgement can be a way of honoring this Indigenous protocol. Whenever I go to Nigeria, I identify myself by the village that I'm in and the people that live in that village, right? Because a lot of those people in that village are directly connected to my lineage. And so it's a way to position oneself in the world. And so we can do land acknowledgements to honor that, but land acknowledgements also interrupt our complicity in ongoing colonization, right? I think we do a really good job of forgetting what has happened, what we've done, and the roles we've played in our ugly history, and we try to, or maybe we don't actively try, but we don't actively think about where we've been as a country and what has happened and what has occurred. And so when we think about land acknowledgements and we name the people that were the original stewards of the land, we're disrupting this complicity. But we're also calling attention to the really amazing community members that still are doing wonderful work, that are still thriving. And so this is in some ways me doing a land acknowledgement, but it is also in a lot of ways me doing a very traditional and ancestral practice of naming who I am in my relationship to the land that I'm on. I also want to note a few things about sort of my background. If I had to distill it down, what do? I do work around racial equity and racial healing. I work at the Denver Public Library as our equity, diversity, and inclusion administrator. But mostly what I think that I spend my time doing is creating space for connection and doing my best to educate, to inform, to create space for dialogue around racial equity and racial healing. That was a really, really long introduction, I know, but I think it's really important for you to know who you're in conversation with today, right? And to do that in a way that is really open, right? I think you can see my bio and take away whatever you want, but I also want to be really forthcoming and transparent about who I am, who my people are, and some of the things that I'm passionate about. Okay, I talked about land acknowledgements and how they interrupt our complicity in ongoing and active genocide and colonization, right? On the screen is a quote that I love a lot. It comes from the book Heavy by Kiese Layman, and it says, "The most abusive parts of our nation obsessively neglect yesterday while peddling impossibility. I remember that we got here by refusing to honestly remember together." And I think the book in its entirety is really, really amazing. There I could say a lot about the book and what it means to me, and that could be its whole webinar. But I think this is really important because it calls attention to the fact that even when we're aspiring for the future, we have to hold space for and honor where we've been and who we've been, right? And if we don't do that, we can create a lot of harm as we're aspiring to be better people, to be part of better organizations and institutions. We can't neglect paying attention to the things that have occurred in the past. I think that we're at a really precarious point in history, and maybe we've always been in one, but it feels particularly piercing at this point in time, I think. And this history includes everything that came before, right? And everything that is now. And the before includes the genocide of the Indigenous peoples, which I've named, right? And the enslavement of Black peoples as well. So I also want to acknowledge that our country was built with stolen labor. I attended a training a couple months ago, and they offered a land acknowledgement as well as a labor acknowledgement. And I thought that was a really profound practice. And part of doing this labor acknowledgement is acknowledging that the generational wealth was created, the generational wealth that exists in this country was created by the hands and the backs of enslaved Africans. And that was done in a way that enriched others, right? And so I want to acknowledge that our country's economy, our country's infrastructure, and the resulting generational wealth that occurred would not exist without the free labor that was produced by chattel slavery, which was a dehumanizing practice whose legacies continue to haunt us to this day. That is really, really important to name for me. So we have this history and this current reality, right, that includes rampant Islamophobia, includes the caging of human beings at the border, includes growing anti-Asian racism, includes transphobia, it includes so many things, as well as a never-ending, it seems, pandemic. If that is our past, if that is our present, what kind of future is possible for us, right? That is something that I have spent a lot of time thinking about, and is what I am hoping to answer today. And so it's important for me to name the past, right? What has occurred and how that bleeds into our current reality before we can get into this conversation about the future. I want to also share that I operate from healing-centered practice. And this sort of moves past a trauma-informed lens, which isn't to say that a trauma-informed lens isn't important. I think that's super, super, super important and imperative. It shapes who I am as a social worker, as a individual personally, but as in every area of my professional life as well. And that approach really means it showed up in the social work field, and in the sort of the mental health profession. But if I had to, in like 2 sentences, distill what trauma informed means, it's really just an approach that understands that every choice we make, every interaction we have, every policy we create, they all have the potential to be re-traumatizing or healing for those we're interacting with and each other and for ourselves, right? And so it's understanding that trauma informs a lot of how we show up in the world. And instead of problematizing people, right, and in the different ways in which they attend to their trauma, or the different ways their trauma might be manifesting, we're asking questions around what has happened, right, to this person, what has happened to community, what has happened, right, and being more thoughtful about asking what has happened instead of what is wrong with you, right? I like the healing-centered practice because it's moving beyond only thinking about trauma and thinking about what are we striving for, right? We're striving for healing at the end of the day, right? If we're thinking about how our interactions, how our choices, how our policies, how the programs we put in place, right? The displays we have can either be re-traumatizing or healing. Thinking about healing very broadly speaking, I try to lean towards pursuing healing in all that I do. And as a social worker, I'm really committed to struggling against oppression and the ways in which I internalize and embody myths and misinformation about my own identity and the identity of other people. And I'm committed to resisting the ways in which systems of oppression show up in my body, right? I'm committed to exercising as much agency as I can over my own experience. And I think that's really important because when we're thinking about a really transformative approach to equity, a really transformative library system, right? I envision it to be a place of healing, of restoration, right? And I think that's important for us to be leaning in towards that as we're acknowledging trauma as well. And so moving past a trauma-informed lens is really inviting us to not stop at thinking about the trauma that might be occurring in a community or in an individual, and thinking about, okay, how do we get to healing? How do we create space for healing to occur? I operate from a praxis of embodiment. I talk about the body a lot, and sometimes people are like, why the body? And I think it's really important to name that we exist in our bodies in these systems of oppression, right? So a transformative approach to equity, a decolonial approach to equity it necessitates a return to body, right? It necessitates understanding that everything that we want to sort of achieve out there has to start within ourselves. Embodiment, on the screen, it says, it's a definition that comes from Prentice Hemphill, who is an amazing practitioner and teacher that does a lot of really great work around teaching and coaching folks about embodiment. And I attended their institute last year. And part of what they said was they provided this definition of embodiment, which I think is really important. And they said, embodiment is what is currently practiced or habituated in us. It is also the process of becoming more aware of our practices and behaviors. So we can think about that in sort of two ways. Embodiment is this idea that we are always practicing and embodying something, right? It is this sort of innate thing that we are replicating and doing. And there's also this idea of embodiment as this very literal return to being in our bodies. I think systems of oppression do their best to disconnect us from ourselves, right? To disconnect us from our emotional reality, to disconnect us from our connection to one another, to the land that we're on, and why we should be good stewards of that. And when we're thinking about embodiment, we're thinking about one, returning to our bodies and being in our actual bodies. But we're also thinking about this idea that we're always embodying something. And if we aren't conscious of what we're embodying, chances are we are embodying the dominant culture. And that probably isn't in alignment with who we are striving to be. And so when we're thinking about embodiment, it's an invitation to think about, what is it that I value and how am I living in alignment with that value? How can I more actively choose to embody those values so that I am exercising more agency over myself and my own experience, right? And I think that's really important because we don't want to just think about equity work or social justice work in the theoretical or in the external. We want to think about it internally. We want to think about what is our own personal connection to it. Because I think when we fundamentally lack connection to ourselves, to our emotions, to one another, to our work, to the land we're on, we lose accountability, right? If we don't feel connected to it, we don't feel responsible. And that allows us to be ignorant or to be participants in different levels of harm, because we're not seeing the ways in which that harm is also connected to ourselves. And so when we're thinking about connection, we're thinking about how am I related to whatever the context that I'm in, whether it is the work and the subject that I'm talking about or the people that I'm in community with, and how am I connected to my own body, right? I think that's really, 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 really important, because if we want true emancipation or social justice, we have to get to that place of connection, of relationality, of accountability, of care and tenderness. We live in a world that disembodies us every single day because of all of the isms. And all we can really do is the little or big or medium amount of good that we can, and do our best to strive towards returning to some of what has been lost, and our industrialization and our colonization. A lot of what Indigenous communities still try to promote and embody, which is this relationality and this place of connection. And that is really important, and it is core to how I approach this work. Okay, so I want us to land in our bodies, since we've been talking about bodies. And I'm gonna offer a very brief mindfulness practice to you all. Like I said, I think it's really important for us to be in our bodies, because it also helps us to process information better, to be more skillful in our interactions with other people. I think one of the things we don't talk about a lot is we are emotional beings. And if we are not paying attention to our emotional reality, we're making the people that we're in community or in conversation with responsible for our emotions, because we're not attending to them, right? And I don't want anyone to have to do that emotional labor, especially people who have been historically marginalized or who might be historically disenfranchised, right? And so I think that it's important for us to be in our bodies and to be connected to ourselves and our emotional reality, so that we can show up in ways that don't create harm, right, to the people that we're in community with, but also if we're moving towards healing, so that we can understand, or at least try to more thoughtfully think about, how can I be the best participant in this space, right? How can I be the best contributor to good in this environment? And so being in our bodies and being really thoughtful about what's going on helps us do that. And so I'm going to offer a very brief mindfulness practice. I want to let you know that this is optional, and if you would just like to be in the space of practice and to just witness, bearing witness is really important as well. There's really a lot of value in just being present, and if that's your choice, that's definitely fine. Also, if at any point this practice becomes too much for you, you can come out of it. It's going to be very brief. But don't feel like you have to stay in it. So I offer that disclaimer, because I don't want you to feel compelled to engage in something you're not wanting to. That being said, I invite you to close your eyes if that's available to you. I know for some people that might be too much. And if that doesn't feel right for you, then just soften your gaze to a point where your eyes might be partially open. Some people need to have visual cues in their environment to know that they're safe, right? Because they might not have felt safe in their bodies, and I don't want to make that assumption. So making people close their eyes when they're not ready to can actually might cause folks to feel more disoriented and not actually grounded. So if that doesn't feel safe for you, go ahead and find what feels good. And so this is a brief practice to get more present, to be more open, to feel more connected, and to align with our purpose for being here today. And the first thing that I want you to do is to bring your attention towards your sense and sensation. You can pay attention to temperatures. What are the different temperatures inside of your body right now? Where are you more cool? Where are you warmer? I want you to pay attention to the pressure happening in your body right now. Whether you're seated or standing, where do you feel more relaxed? Where perhaps do you feel more tense? Where might you even feel or find a quality of numbness? I want you just to be with that and notice it with kind of a wide and curious, relaxed attention. I want you to also pay attention to movement. There might be tingling or streaming or pulsing. All of these things are the language of sensations. Sensations are happening all the time, and they're kind of our first language. And from there, sensations might come and coagulate or kind of form into an emotion. I often find that my grief shows up in my chest, my anger sometimes deep in my belly. And then sometimes I create a narrative, right? We create narratives all the time. And a lot of times we're trained to just be in our internal narrative all the time. So how do we get to presence, to being back in the present? Let's just take a couple of breaths. Take a deep inhale. And a deep exhale. And just notice where your breath is and isn't. And then begin to gently let your breath deepen. And if it helps, you can put a hand on your center. On the screen, there's a GIF or GIF, I don't know which pronunciation is more accurate, of a person with their hand on their belly and a hand on their chest. And there's sort of plant imagery in the background moving, and you get the sense that they're inhaling and exhaling, they're breathing deeply. They're finding their center. We organize ourselves around centers. It's a dropped place in our bodies. And it's important to figure out how to find our ways back to our center. To gently let your breath deepen and move towards your center. There's a practice that I really like that invites us to think about centering in 4 directions, right? So thinking about centering in length, letting ourselves fill out in our full length, letting ourselves settle into our lower bodies, and then lengthening through our upper bodies. You might feel for more space between the vertebrae and your back, or your weight dropping more into your gravity, into your hips, or into your lower body, but centering from top to bottom. So we're centering and settling and lengthening at the same time. We say that this is a way that we can practice centering dignity. So centering in our own inherent dignity. And then noticing that in others. Noticing it in all life. So just take a good deep breath and lengthen as we center. And then from all of that length, we're going to center in width. So coming out, sort of just unfurling the left side and the right side. You might sort of lean from side to side, test your balance back and forth, left to right, because we want to find and lean into good balance down our center line. Filling out across your back, across your front. You might find your width across your collarbones. You might take a deep breath and let your ribs expand from side to side. Find that width. Find it maybe in your hips. Centering in width, centering in that expansiveness, finding good balance from side to side. We talk about this as the social space or community space. So we're balancing in community space, letting ourselves out and letting others in. And now we're going to center in depth from back to front. So many of our sensing organs are in the front. So let's start with the back. Noticing any sensations maybe between your shoulder blades or your glutes or the back of your legs. Just notice your back body and even feel or imagine perhaps your lineage behind you. And your lineage can be a lot of different things. It could be your particular ancestral lineage, right? It could be the lineage of teachers you come from, teachers being different kinds of teachers, right? Traditional and non-traditional. It could even be the social movements that are at our backs. It's this big sort of evolutionary lineage too, right? There's billions of years of evolutionary wisdom behind us, and it's coming into our internal space. So see if you can make a little bit more space front to back, more space for your organs, for your breath, more space to sense and feel yourself internally. If you can, you might also find kind of the long bones, the femurs in your legs, right? And then come all the way to the front side. You might feel that in your nose or your chin or your sternum. The same thing that we did from left to right. Think about balancing back and front. So we're not pushed forward and we're not pulling back. But we're on this balanced space and we can have our back or insides, our front sides, all of it in balance, right? Just feel all of that length, that width, that depth. Practice being present, open, and connected. And then the last thing we center on is who and what matters to you, or your purpose, or your calling. And really feel that. Not just think of it, really go, what am I called to? What's important to me? Name it to yourself, or just feel it for yourself, and then really let that inform your whole nervous system. We're practicing being what's important to us and letting it guide us, letting it shape us. We practice the centering practice so that we really build it in our muscle memory. So when we get tweaked or thrown off or reactive, we can return to our center not to tap anything down or suppress, but being able to lengthen in width and depth and on purpose. And we can be centered and sad, or we can be centered and angry, or we can be centered and upset. But centering gives us a different place to be from, and it also makes a choice. It allows us to make choices, right? And so let's come back together. And the last thing we do in a centering practice is we just check in and go, how's my emotional state, or how's my mood? And so if you want to, you can go ahead and put in the chat how your mood is after centering. And we'll move on. Serene, relaxed, calm, curious, a little emotional. Awesome. I want to be thoughtful and mindful of time. I just think it's really important to show and set up space. And so I do spend a lot of time there. As I introduce you to this idea of radical imagination, I want you to be present, which is what we just did. We got present to practice wonder and curiosity about this topic, to listen as generously as you can to the information that I will share, to take care of yourself. So if you need to go and get water, if you need to get breakfast because your stomach is grumbling, go ahead and do that. And to check your ego. I think sometimes we operate out of our ego, and that disrupts our willingness to receive new information, especially information that can be really, really helpful. So I invite you to do that however that seems fit. And then to be willing to learn, to grow, to feel, to be in your body. These are really important because it also is what we invite the participants in the radical imagination game to do, which is what I will talk about. So what is radical imagination? We spent a lot of time sort of getting in our bodies and setting up the stage. Now we'll get into the theoretical. I think it's important to think about defining radical. Radical means proceeding or relating to a root, right? Returning back to this original sort of state of being. It also means very different from the usual or traditional. The third definition that comes from Merriam-Webster that's on the screen is also favoring extreme changes in existing views, habits, or institutions. So radical really means sort of returning back to an original or indigenous way of doing things that's very traditional from the usual traditional way of doing things, and favoring something that is extremely different than the current way of believing or habituating or operating. Imagination, that's next on the screen, is then the act or power of forming a mental image of something not present to the senses or never before wholly perceived in reality. So not something that hasn't existed before that we're sort of calling into our minds or into our consciousness. It's a creative ability, right? It's something that we're choosing to do or we're trying to do. And it's a creation of the mind. It exists in not in the physical realities, but in our sort of our lived realities. So when we combine that, radical imagine then for me becomes this audacity to live in the world as it is and dream something different, coupled with the willingness to believe it is possible even if you cannot see it. Radical imagination is how we engage dusty imaginations in order to create a more radical vision for social justice, for our communities, for our libraries, right? One that is different from the usual, one that returns us back to more indigenous, more connected, more relational ways of doing things. It's the refusal to believe that all we see is all there is or is all there ever can be. It's this humility to ask questions of ourselves, of each other, and of the world that we're living in. It's the courage required to be a conscious learner and unlearner. And I think radical imagination can show up in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways it shows up for me that I'm actively practicing is in this game that I created with a friend of mine. And I'll share that in the next slide. But I think it's really important because we need to be able to push forward our radical politics, right? And thinking about the word radical, not in sort of the way it's been co-opted or sort of socialized, but thinking about returning us to more traditional ways of being, more connected ways of being in some ways, as well as returning us to ways or moving us in directions that are unlike where we are currently. In order for us to do that, we have to be able to expand the realm of what is possible, to be bolder, right? To stretch that radical imagination. And so we need tools to practice that. Radical imagination to me is about having the courage to ask, what if, and then why not, and then with who, right? I think there are so many solutions to the many issues we face. And one of the things that I see is that we get stuck in the scarcity mindset and this fear mindset, the sense of despair. And I'm not going to say that there isn't a lot for us to be feeling despair or fear about, right? But there's also a lot of potentiality. None of us are going to individually have all of the answers, nor should we sort of expect ourselves to, but we should be or strive to be as creative as we can be together. I think it's really important to think about how crisis blows open the door of what is possible. And one of the most beautiful gifts this pandemic has given us is this more expansive sense of what is possible. And I have been so grateful to see that take place at the library. A very sort of tangible example is one of the things we were thinking about as all of this was happening in March of 2020, we were thinking about how even before the pandemic, library workers were having to show up in really difficult ways for our community, right? We talk about how library workers are sometimes asked to be pseudo social workers in some ways, and that can cause a wear and tear to the body, right? That takes emotional labor, and that can also trigger vicarious trauma and all of these other things. And so thinking about that sort of aspect of wellness, and then thinking about wellness as we were being forced to isolate, some of us were still having to show up, and we're dealing with a lot of anxiety about the uncertainty that came with this pandemic. We knew wellness was really important. And in conversation, we were like, what if we had wellness hours? What if we as staff had time to prioritize our wellness, because we know that this job requires that of us? And then we said, okay, well, why not? What do we need to do in order for that to happen? And that isn't to say that the why not wasn't big in some ways and that there weren't a lot of why nots, but the why nots, when we listed them out, were all things that we could handle, were all things that we could manage, right? It took some time to manage it. It took a year, but we got to the place after figuring out the with who did we need to connect with to make this possible? Who in HR did we need to collaborate with? How did we get this to the attention of our exec team? How do we make sure that whatever sort of offering we put forth is as equitable as possible? And then we did it. In October, we rolled out wellness hours. And so our staff have 8 hours a quarter, up to 8 hours a quarter, that they can use for wellness along the 8 dimensions. So not sort of choosing for folks how they're defining wellness. If they want to focus on occupational wellness or physical wellness or emotional wellness, or financial wellness, right? But inviting space for that. And part of that comes from this courage, right? To see the current reality, to understand what's happening, and then to think, okay, well, what if it was different? And then why can't it be different? And then who do I need to connect with to make it different? Radical imagination is about creating, on the screen now is a picture of me from a TEDx talk that I gave about radical imagination. But this radical imagination is about creating those small moments that can replicate and rewire our brains so that we're more oriented around curiosity and wonder instead of fear and despair. I think this is really, really important because we can't sort of live only in this trauma brain or this deprived brain or this scarcity mindset brain, right? We want to be acting from this place of curiosity also, so that we can see the potential and then be able to lean in that potential and make things possible or real that might have been outside of our sense of possibility in the past. To wonder is to cultivate a sense of awe and openness to others' thoughts and experiences, their pains, their wants, and their needs. It's to look upon the face of anything or anyone and say, you are a part of me I do not yet know. It's this orientation towards humility. It's recognizing that others are as complex and infinite to themselves as we are to ourselves. Wondering, according to Valley Core, gives us information for how to love others. I can talk a lot again about Valerie Kaur and what she means, but See No Stranger is a really, really great book. And she invites us to really, really think thoughtfully about wonder. Oops. So now, I did not mean to include that other slide. I want to introduce, I look at the time, the Proyecto Sobremesa, the radical imagination game. So moving from theory, right, this idea of, okay, how do we lean into possibility? How do we find ways to practice even the act of leaning in towards possibility, right? I think that we are taught to analyze and to deconstruct, but we don't find or create enough space to think about how do we create and how do we create together? How do we imagine together, right? How do we practice creativity? Because if we're thinking about where we want our libraries to go, we have to think of it as a creative project, right? I think social justice is my most favorite creative pursuit, right? Because it requires such expansive thinking and imagining and dreaming and stretching of the mind. And if we're not finding time and space to practice that, I worry that we're not going to be able to do that when we need to, when we're strategically planning, right? When we're creating our strategic plans, if we haven't been practicing creative thinking or imagination, then we're not gonna be able to flex that muscle. So how do we find ways to flex that muscle so that we're actively trying to be as creative, as imaginative, as future forward thinking as we can be? And so that's what the Proyecto Sobremesa game is. It was created by me and my dear friend, Bobby LeFebre, who is Colorado's Poet Laureate. And he received a grant from the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture to create a project to foster radical imagination and racially just systems, which is exactly as vague and as broad as it sounds. And so he reached out to me and was like, hey, I got this grant and I've got this idea, right? I want us to be able to just talk and be in community and to figure out together what these systems need to look like and what we need to how we need to be in these systems. And through conversation, through several discussions, we arrived at the radical imagination game. And it's really, really, really simple. And I appreciate how simple it is. But it's a way to foster radical imagination and is an act of radical imagination itself. And so on the screen are two bowls. One has a bowl of pillars. And so what we do is we selected rather pillars that we thought were really important for a radically imagined society. And I've done this with library professionals across the nation, pillars that they think are really important for their library system. So things like accountability, reciprocity, honesty, connection, empathy, those being the values that sort of shape their connection to their institution and to themselves, right? And into their community. And we have these values that go into one bucket of pillars. So the pillars that really anchor us to what we what we want our radically imagined world or organization or library to be. And then we've got a bowl of sentence stems. And these are really prompts to invite self-awareness and to invite us to think about what is our relationship to these things that we value. And they include things like, when is the last time you experienced, or what is your commitment to, or what messages have you been taught about? And what we do is we have these two bowls, right, of pillars, the values we hold near and dear to our communities, to our work, to ourselves. And then we've got our sentence stems. And we pull from the bowl of sentence stems, and we pull from the bowl of pillars. We take one from each, and then we create a question and we pose it to the group, right? Because we're gathering, we do this in small group conversation. We're gathering people together to figure out, okay, what is our relationship to these things that we value? And how do we use that then to anchor us into a different sense of what is possible for ourselves and for our institutions? As we're doing this, we're thinking about community accountability. Community accountability is about preventing, intervening, and responding to and healing from violence through strengthening relationships in communities, emphasizing mutual responsibility for addressing the conditions that allow violence to take place, and holding people accountable to harm. In other words, accountability is the work that we do to prevent, intervene, respond to, and heal from the harm caused by systems of oppression. And so before we get into the game, because Bobby and I we played it in a number of different ways. At first, we were gathering BIPOC cultural workers in our community, so artists, teachers, healers, educators, and we gathered 8 at a time, and we played the game, and we gave this definition of accountability. And then we drew from these sentence stems, and we created space for conversation. But we always framed it, right, with this definition of accountability. So we were understanding that even if we're thinking about what is possible for ourselves or for organizations, it is also thinking about how do we attend to harm while we're doing this dreaming, so that we're not creating institutions that are, one, causing harm or replicating harm, right? But we're also creating institutions that can better respond to harm in real time. We also invite community agreements. I won't go over these just for the sake of time, but really making sure that we're all coming from the same place before we go into conversation. Recently, we asked participants to share some words that captured how these experiences made them feel, because I think I can provide this sort of description of this game and what it looks like, but I think having a tangible, what does it inspire? A colleague, or not a colleague, a friend of mine, now a colleague in some ways, reached out and shared how the game inspired him to really think about who he was and who he wanted to be in the world, right? Who he wanted to be in his relationship, right? In his marriage. And part of that pondering that happened after that game is he changed jobs. He went from the senior vice president of a bank to being his country's first equity, diversity, and inclusion manager, or first equity, diversity, and inclusion vice president. And so now he's doing that work, right? And in conversation recently, he shared how the game helped him tap into not only authenticity, right, but it helped him really think about what he wanted to create in the world. I talked to his wife, and she shared how he talked about the game for weeks after he played, that there was a new energy to him that she'd never seen before, that he was more eager about his work in a way that made him, one, just a better human being, but a better friend and partner as well. That just spending a few times activating his radical imagination, his sense of possibility, literally changed his life. And I have heard that from so many people that have participated in the experience, right? One, just being able to be in conversation with other people and talking about possibility, that in and of itself can feel very restorative and healing, because it takes a lot of courage, yes, to think of the sense of possibility. But when you're trying to do that with other people, that takes a certain amount of vulnerability as well, right? You're exposing what you believe, which is in some ways in response to what has happened to you. And so it is a beautiful way to find connection, but also to find connection and creativity around a common goal or objective. And when we asked participants to share some of the words that really captured how it made them feel, they said hopeful, they said stimulated, they said emancipated, they said charged, they said rejuvenated, decolonized, soothed, enlightened, heard, expand, united, deeply touched, excited, regenerated, connected, inspired, appreciative. And so I wonder, what is possible when we feel that way more often? When we feel that way, when we show up to the work that we're doing, right? Regardless of how that shows up in our own professional library world or in our personal world, what is possible when we're feeling charged and appreciative and inspired and stimulated and hopeful? What good can we do? And what good does that bring us, right? And so for me, the ultimate utility of the game is sparking the sense of possibility, yes, but also the beauty of it is what that sense of possibility does for us and how that drives innovation and creativity and dreaming in a way that restores us as we're doing very difficult work. Because when we were piloting this game, we did it with people who were showing up to community each and every day. And almost every dinner, people were emotional, right? They were talking about how they don't feel poured into, right? They don't feel the chance to imaginate and to strategize in a way that feels restorative and healing. And so it's important for us to find ways to get to that place so that we can, as someone said in the chat, we can say yes and not just no. We can say, what if? We can say, why not? And with who instead of not possible, right? Because that's what our communities need right now. And so the application of this, how do we practically apply this, right? Professionally, bringing radical imagination into your innovation, into your organization can increase innovation, right? When you're doing that with strategic planning, it shifts how we think about things, right? Working with our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Advisory Council, we often found ourselves running into this rut of, oh, we know all of the things that are wrong with the organization, right? We know all of the ways in which HR might not be serving us, right? And instead of just focusing on all of that, right? Like, what if HR looked different? What if this policy was here? And then why not? And with who do we need to work with to make that happen? And doing that changes our relationship to the work, but it also helps us to figure out what is it we're committed to. We're not committed to harm, right? So spending time attending to the harm all the time isn't going to serve us. We're committed to this place, this organization, this space that all participants can thrive in. And so how do we practice ways to get there? And how do we use that to help us guide how we create our strategic plans, how we create our visions for what we're doing, right? I think relationally, we can bring radical imagination into our relationships, right? I've played it with friends, and it's a way I said it in my first slide or one of my previous slides that I love wings. And so I had a wings giving. I invited people to bring their favorite wings. They could make it themselves, or they could go to a restaurant and find and bring their favorite flavor. And then we played the game. And I used it as a way to understand this group of disparate folks in some ways. I had a personal connection to them all, but they didn't have a connection to one another, right? But to understand who these people were and to create space for them to connect with one another. And it was a beautiful experience. Each time that I've played it, relationships have deepened in really profound ways. And then personally, right? These are prompts that you can ask yourself as a journal practice. Creating a wonder practice can spark your imagination and can deepen your self-awareness in really, really profound ways. And Valerie Kaur talks about wonder. She's got a wonder practice that I'll share. She says that every day for a week or a time frame of your choosing, practice seeing no stranger or practice wondering, right? Asking yourself questions like, who is this person? What do they eat for breakfast? What's the last book that they read? I wonder what their first love was like. Because when we do this, we're training ourselves to see them as people, right? Instead of the biases or the assumptions that we might have about them. And by doing that, that trains ourselves to move past our innate assumptions that we're making, because we're all socialized around assumptions, right? Our minds automatically sort of try to categorize and place people into boxes. And so we have to actively practice how not to do that. We have to actively practice embodying something different, right? Embodying wonder to challenge how we make assumptions about other people. And so by practicing wonder, either externally about the world that we're sort of taking in, but also about ourselves. Like, what am I feeling right now? Why am I feeling that? What do I believe about this particular thing? Why do I believe it? Who taught me that? Why do I believe it's true? Right? Asking ourselves disrupts sort of the thing, it disrupts our attachment to what we've been socialized, especially when that socialization has been based in oppressive assumptions or oppressive messaging. And so some questions to guide your wondering. What did you notice today as you conducted this exercise? Who are the people it was easiest to wonder about? Who is most challenging and why? What does that tell you? What will you do with that information? What surprises you about the practice? Does it reveal any strong feelings or biases? And what was this practice like for you? What did you learn about yourself as you practice wonder? And I think that allows us to also be able to be participants in more inclusive organizational cultures, right? We do a lot of work, right, to learn about other cultural identities, but it isn't just enough to like know theoretically like what someone's cultural identity might be, but we have to move past just this awareness to this curiosity, right? This genuine wondering, so that we feel more connected to them, so that we feel more accountable to their experience, right? That is what inclusion really necessitates, that we are all feeling responsible for fostering a culture where everyone feels connected, where everyone feels in some ways able to find belonging. They feel seen and they feel supported. And so as an individual, we can practice wonder so that we can show up in our organizations in a way that can help foster that more inclusive culture.